Firstly, it's a privilege to be speaking to you all today, and we're most grateful on Robertson Futures side that so many have come out today. Also, I'd just like to mention Judy Hannon, who's recently elected to Parliament, who's here, and a very warm welcome to Judy. Just in relation to my presentation, one of the key elements I want to bring out here is the interdependence between environmental, social and economic considerations if we're genuinely going to have best practice in sustainability. There was a period when there was a great focus just on the environmental side, but in reality, if we're looking at the practical day-to-day about how the way people live, the way they work, the way they shop and move around, if we want to reduce our carbon footprint, then we have to have a clear understanding of the interdependence of all those things. And that's one of the key messages I hope I'll leave with you before the end of the day. I always like to start with this arresting little slide. It shows you what a challenge we've got. And this is a global situation. This is our human population growth, and we're up to 8 billion last November, and there's huge pressure globally on the planet. I think it's referred to the Anthropocene, the period when mankind has affected the globe. And today I'm also trying to focus on the role that we can play as individuals and as a community in addressing this major challenge. I talked about these three. We have to try and get into that green patch in the middle. And especially I want to talk today about urban design as how we design our communities and how they function so that we can position ourselves in that green spot. Now, social sustainability. I've got a couple of slides. I'm trying to expand our thinking about these three sustainability issues. I think if we're going to make any progress from an urban design point of view, the community has to come together with a vision. It's no good, as we've been doing so often in the past, of sitting in our trenches and throwing rocks at one another if someone has a different idea to you. I think we have to get back to the older days when we sat together and talked about the things that a community really needs for itself, and we could develop a common vision. After all of the things I'm going to talk about today are well-proven principles. I just want to bring them together in a format that might crystallise in your minds about how we can move Robertson as a township and how we can be better equipped to purposefully reduce our carbon footprint. One of the key elements in social sustainability is the acceptance of the need to cater for all demographics. Robertson doesn't do very well on that side, you'll see later. To achieve that, we need a diverse housing choice. And the other key element, and this is fundamental to Robertson's performance, is the availability of local goods and services for our weekly needs for our residents. In a bit more detail, extensive footpath network. A friend of mine in Melbourne, he's a principal designer for the City of Melbourne some time ago, Oxford Masters, and probably Australia's leading urban designers who we had speak here at one of our earlier forums. He said that walking is the glue that binds a community together. We don't meet one another when we're driving to Moss Vale or Bowral, and we don't commonly treat a large supermarket as a site of casual social connections. Shade, shelter and seating for high street pedestrians. We have to make our high street, our main street, a place that's comfortable for our local folks when they're going to the high street. We need quality halls and meeting rooms. We have that, we're pretty well equipped in Robertson. It's rather interesting that this hall is not owned by the council. It's owned by a local trust and built by the local community years ago and maintained. So it's an indication of the underlying strength of this community that we have a hall of this quality delivered by the community itself. And of course, catering for all age groups, extensive shared sport and cultural facilities. On environmental sustainability, dramatic reduction in our carbon footprint is the focus. If there's an elephant in the room, it's a bull elephant in rut on this one. And I think the world is really waking up. Australia is waking up to how serious that is. The most recent survey I've seen, 80% of Australians now accept the science behind global warming. 50% believe we have emergency situation, but not all of that 50% are really actively doing something about it. So that's really the state of play at the moment. Availability of local retail goods and services. If we don't have them locally for our residents, we're going to get in our car and drive 44k round trip to Moss Vale or 54k round trip to Bowral, and that's not sustainable, and we're pushing gas into the atmosphere. Steve Thorne, the urban designer I referred to, when he spoke here, he'd done some work on Robertson and estimated that the Robertson community is spending $2.6 million a year in transport costs because we don't have a large enough supermarket to serve our weekly needs. That's really an interesting point. So this is a key element to environmental sustainability, is the availability of local retail goods and services. A lot of people haven't tied that one together. If you can live where you work and work where you live. Now, we need housing, and if we have a wider range of local goods and services, there'll be more local retail jobs here. We need, if we're looking at the genuine sustainability with resource depletion globally, we need to build smaller dwellings that last longer and have a very high passive energy efficiency rating, maybe 7.5 as a minimum. Compact communities. What Robertson needs, like many other places, is put our more diverse housing choice close to the centre so that it's in walking distance. And if we have our density in those locations, we're not disturbing the freestanding dwellings further out in that township, and by lifting the density, we're saving space. Density preserves open space. That's one of the mantras. We need to recycle our waste materials. And I understand from some work that Siva Kumar's done, he's a Professor of Environmental Science at Wollongong University, and he spoke here. He said that Robertson is basically on a par with everyone else. We're not spectacularly good, but we're on average. We need to use energy generated from renewable sources. We know all about this pretty well, but there's not enough of us have photovoltaic on our roofs. We need to fully electrify our homes, no more gas. And we need to reduce travel demand, and of course that's tied to having availability of local goods and services. Economic sustainability. We had Mike Cullen speak at one of our earlier functions here. He's an urban economist and he specialises in Main Street retail. So he was able to tell us that unless we get a population of around 3,000 in the catchment, then it's unlikely that we're going to attract a grocer that's large enough to provide our weekly needs. The convenience store we have downtown is about 200 metres, and we need about 1,000 metre floor space. And it's at that point that the marketplace, in other words the Robertson citizens, will shop locally because they can have the diversity of products that they need. This is a key element right through my talk, is the importance of achieving this objective. It generates additional local jobs. Mike said if we did get a grocer of that size and the other businesses that would suddenly pop up, because when you go to Moss Vale or Bowral, you spend money at other businesses there. So if their weekly needs are here, there'll be a whole string of other small businesses pop up and provide services locally. So that's the catalyst. And he said 70 or maybe an additional 70 to 100 jobs would be generated as a result of that. And it does foster those new business, as suggested. Now, diverse housing choice is a critical one for Robertson, and we need to cater for not just the people who are living in their freestanding dwellings, but seniors downsizing, the local service workers, singles and renters, first home buyers, and multiple family types. And those demographics are not really being catered for in Robertson at the moment. Why this is important from an economic sustainability point of view, we have reduced household expenditure on travel, increased local expenditure on retail services. If we have good footpath infrastructure in the town, we know that the most loyal of customers are the ones who walk to their businesses. Once you're in a car, you can drive anywhere, it's quite easy. And one of the other things we need to do is provide land for local service industry businesses. So let's look at what we value in Robertson. These are just a few pictures that we thought picture tells 1,000 words, and these are some interesting aspects of Robertson that really identify the visual character of the place. You're all familiar with some of these. We've got great structure essentially in Robertson. It's quite diverse, the range of services we have here, facilities, and this is the Yarrow brush. In fact, Greg Morris and I and our wife just walked up and had a quick look at the Yarrow brush a few moments ago. Now, just a little bit on history. With 20 convicts, Surveyor Hoddle was instructed to survey the edge of the Winjaki swamp and then follow the ridge lines actually down to Kiama. In encountering the Yarrow brush in the area, he recorded, "The most formidable brush I have ever seen since I have been in this colony. It abounds with every species of prickle bush, vine, bramble and nettle. The vines so thickly entwined around the huge trees as to render the sun obscure at a time when it shone with great brilliancy." So of the original 2,500 hectares of Yarrow brush, there's only 20% remaining by 1900. Now, the history of Robertson Township, Surveyor Hoddle surveyed that line to Kiama in 1830. In 1862, the Governor of New South Wales proclaimed the reservation of a 1 square mile block of land for the purpose of establishing the town, and it was named Yarrowa, but later changed to Robertson after the politician John Robertson. In 1865, the street layout of that reservation was approved, and 2 months later the first blocks were sold. It was 2 decades later before significant development took place in the town. Now, this is the square mile of Robertson. Now, these traditional townships were set out in grid pattern. Grid patterns are by far the best because there's multiple choices about moving in different directions. It's not like the modern suburbanist sprawl model, which is a series of collector roads and curvilinear streets. It's the grid pattern, it's more of the classical line. This is the Kalong Creek, and it essentially separates this area here to the one street coming down here. This is the Kalong Road. So if you live over here, you've got to travel here, here, here to come back to here. So in terms of connectivity, there probably needs to be some improvement just there. Now, the other thing is in about 1829 or 30 or thereabouts, the rail line came through and did another severance of the south side. So we only have this one street here that crosses the railway line in the middle of the town. There is a small one here just east of the cheese factory, and the other one is over this side. So in a way, we've had that beautiful advantages of an interconnected town through a grid pattern interrupted here. One of the biggest assets we have that's not really well developed is our rear lanes. You can see here behind all of our commercial area, we have these rear lanes. And I think this is one of the only ones developed here. This one's undeveloped. But when we were at Kiama Council, we worked overtime to try and reinsert rear lanes. It's such an important aspect of getting our town planning right. Now, I just want to now move on to another big picture one to arrest your attention again. Australia's won the blue ribbon here. We've got of all the advanced Western nations, we have the highest per capita carbon footprint in Australia. And you can see we're probably almost 3 times higher than the UK, for example. We've got a long way to go. G20 average, you see down the bottom again. We've got some problems here, and we're behind the 8 ball in terms of the global effort by Western countries to try and improve. And I think that's rather an arresting graph, because if we think we're getting it right just because 20% of us have got solar on our roofs and we recycle our goods, our household refuse, and we might mulch our green waste or whatever and compost that, that's not enough. And the area in which we can impact on this personally and in a communal way is in transport and buildings. Now, the heat and electricity, that's the big generators out there, and that's government policy. We have some solar on our roofs, that's very good. But how we can modify our lives and improve the efficiency of our buildings is the area that I'm keen to have explored here, because that's the area that we can make great progress. Professor Kumar did a talk here, and this is from his talk, and this is from his analysis and research on the people of Robertson. This is our profile as a community. We have a strong animal-based diet. 30% of food is unprocessed or locally grown. We live in freestanding houses, in a house predominantly wood construction, 3 people in a large home. We use electricity of above average efficiency. Well, that's a positive. 20% of our energy comes from renewable sources. Typically, we're on average with generation of waste. We do 300 km per week by car on average. There's no carpooling. There is some public transport, but not what you would say is a robust transport system. And we do, on average, a 124-hour flight per year. I guess that's going over and back if we go to Europe, for example. So that's a bit of our profile. Now, this slide is really to show you how important the urban structure of a place is. This work was done by a fellow of the Brookings Institute. In the Brookings Institute, apparently, they've done some work on this, whereas of the average US household budget, 19% is spent on transport. If you live in the US in a sprawl suburb on the edge of one of your large cities, 24% of your household budget is spent on transit of one kind or another. But if you live in a compact township with Main Street retail and diverse housing choice, where people can live where they work and work where they live, and they've got all local services, 9%. Now that's a dramatic improvement, and this shows you the value of thinking about the structure of the place and how important it is from a perspective of reducing our carbon footprint per capita if we get the urban structure right. And Professor Kumar said, if the whole of the world wanted to live like Australia and live like that indefinitely, we need another 6.5 planets. What that really means is the way things have been is not the way they're going to be in the future. There are major changes coming. So ageing in place. We do have a very large seniors population, and look at this chart. This is really interesting. In 2001, people think Robertson's not changing. Some people say, I don't want to see any change. I'm very happy. Well, it's changing under your feet, I can tell you. It's changed dramatically. In 2001, the census figures show that Robertson had a population of 1,017. Today it's about 2,020. Population doubled in 20 years. But look at this demographic. I don't think I've ever seen a demographic shift like this. The green is Robertson, and this is a percentage of the population that's over 55. 17% of the population over 55 in 2001 census 20 years ago. Today, 38%. I don't think I've ever seen such a dramatic demographic shift as that in 20 years. And what's happened to the rest of the population is the 30 to 55-year-olds that proportion of the population has declined sharply in Robertson. So that's really important. If you look at the state figures, or the Australian figures, we've moved from 22 to 29% in that over 55 group. And that corresponds to the ageing baby boomers. That's a general shift right across the community. So you can see how dramatically Robertson has shifted in that arena. And it also highlights the importance of providing downsizing dwellings for seniors and other considerations such as footpaths, for example, where people like to walk around. Now here's the other major shortfall. This is the major shortfall in Robertson as well. Freestanding dwellings. In New South Wales, which is the blue, 65% of all dwellings are freestanding dwellings and 35% all other types of dwellings. There might be terraces and townhouses and villas, units for rental, tiny homes, whatever. So that's the state average. In Robertson, 99% of our houses are freestanding and 1% other. So we don't have a housing choice for a vast segment of our community. Now, what's the consequence of that? I'll give you a couple of examples. I spoke to a young chap who was a barista in one of our cafes. So you're local? He said, no, I live in Picton. So he commutes for a modest job, modest paid job, commutes 50 minutes each way every day because he'd like to be here, but there's no housing for him. But let's look at the consequence on the business operator. As soon as that person finds a job closer to Picton, guess what's going to happen? Quits the job here and he saves his commuting cost, but he also saves from a social perspective. He's saving an hour 40 a day of his free time. That's a massive saving from his social perspective. So you can see how these things catapult into one another. And you come back to the structural issue. If we get our urban structure right, a lot of these things will self-resolve. These are some of the types of dwellings that we need in our district. Shop-top housing, we need more of that. All of these are opportunities for singles. Don't forget 24% of the population of our houses are occupied by one person. 24% of all dwellings in New South Wales, one person in them. They don't need to rattle around in a big home. In fact, as you get older, you want to live in a simpler life. And by the way, the average new house in New South Wales is 240 metres. That's the average size of a new dwelling. It doesn't need to be that big. We need more diversity. So if we have these additional dwellings, they're best located in and near the town centre. They cater for singles, service workers, which I mentioned, renters, seniors downsizing. A survey in Melbourne showed that 50% of people over 60 said they would happily move and downsize if a suitable housing product was available. Now, I just want to talk about the seniors here for a moment. There's quite often people think you retire and stay in your own home. That's one option. 2, you move to a retirement village. And 3, you might end up in a nursing home. 1 in 8 of us will end up spending some time in a nursing home. Only 1 out of every 8. But there's a segment here that we're not focusing on enough, and this is the downsizing model, where people are in their full state of independence, they have their own driving capacity, but these houses are built with an open plan bathroom, no steps, wider doors and hallways. So if you need to move around in a wheelchair for a 6-week period, you've had a titanium knee put in or something, and you need to be in a wheelchair, you can stay in your own home. And for a period in your declining years, you can be nursed at home, have a daycare nursing. Now that's 1/3 of the cost compared to if you were in a nursing home. So from a broad structural point of view, the economy of the nation, we need to be building more of this and not treating this group as being infirm. It's just that they're just shifting from their family home. They downsize into something smaller that's really convenient, a small, no-fuss courtyard. I don't want to see another mower again, thanks. And you'll find that this particular group are often considered infirm because they're over 65. And there was one centre down the coast where the council of the day said you must have a bus, a private bus at self-care seniors. You must have a bus and it must be available for operation 12 hours a day or whatever. After it was established, all the people have got their own cars. They didn't need this cost. And so they voted as a group to get rid of that, even though it was against the development approval. because they just didn't need it. They said it's a waste of resources. And so we have to think differently about this segment. They're not infirm. It's a readjustment of their housing choice, but they're in their independent years and they go grey and they go cruising and they house minding for their children or whatever. And this is an area that needs to be given more thought in a regulatory sense. And this product is certainly not available in Robertson. Robertson's very short on footpaths. This is my only pick. I don't need to say any more than this. And I asked this lady, may I take this shot and use it in the presentation? She said, you're most welcome. It would be nice to have some footpaths. She walks about 600 metres down to the main street, and there's not one footpath in the whole of that. Council did a very good study in 2013 called a PAMPS study, Pedestrian Access Mobility Plan study, and it identified where the priorities should be for footpaths in Robertson. Robertson Futures team looked at this and we agreed with every part of their recommendation, but that was 10 years ago, and we just haven't had the capital expenditure that's necessary in footpathing in a town of our size. I think we've been a bit neglected, I have to say, in that arena. But this is such an important thing. Walking is the glue that binds a community together. Now, onto the rear lanes. These are some of the benefits of our rear lane. This is how it is currently, and these are some of the benefits. Firstly, we've got a state highway going through our main street, and it alleviates the need for driveways off the highway, across the curb and gutter, and onto the property. If there's any segment where there's a high pedestrian access, pedestrian use of the footpath, and you've got a vehicle trying to get into private property across that, it's just not best practice. And because we have this, it was set up originally structurally to have this rear lane, we've got this fantastic resource. And I would like to see this really strengthened from council's point of view, because once that goes in, there are a whole range of options that can take place. Each driveway crossing that you remove, there's one additional car park in the main street. That's a plus. And if the rear lane is properly developed, there are opportunities for unique residential, like Fonzie flats and things at the back. And that's a really important element, because when you have people living above garages in those little singles units, that provides passive surveillance for the rear lanes. And there are generally much improved opportunity for smaller residential development and mixed use, have parking coming in from the rear and shop top housing. It just is a catalyst for getting things to move in what I believe is the right direction. These are some little pictures of studio apartments sitting above some garages in a rear lane. It's an example of how they can look if they're well developed. Now, street trees, if you're looking at buildings, windows and doors and the proportion of windows and doors give character to a building. It's a classical statement. Otherwise, it's just a box. So if you get the proportions right, you can really add grace to a building. But for a street, it's large street trees that give grace to the street. And this particular street, these trees are 15 years old. If you choose the right species, not little shrubs and what have you, something that really grows have some scale, it dramatically alters the ambience of that street. And some of the benefits, it really does enhance the sense of place and character. It provides shade and reduces street temperature. This is really important. It improves resident amenity significantly. The people who live in that street say that's one of the most valuable things for them is the scale trees. It encourages walking because it enhances the walking experience, creates visual and sound buffers, improves air quality, and provides some habitat, as long as it's not Indian miners. Now, looking to the future, I mentioned earlier that some people say that we shouldn't have any change. Well, change is happening and happening rapidly. There's the ancient saying, I picked this up from the East, that the only certainty in life is change itself. And for us, with the imperatives we're facing with our global population pressures, with our challenges to contain our carbon footprint, the speed of change is going to be accelerated from here on in. And I think legislative changes are going to drive that. I would say in a decade time, it might start to get hard to buy an internal combustion engine. This is certainly happening in many countries in the world where legislation is coming in and you'll have an all-electric vehicle. There'll be changes in social attitudes as the community recognises the risks inherent in higher global temperatures. They're going to be more assertive on how we all conduct ourselves. So there will be major changes come through there. Resource depletion is a key issue. I think it's a bit of a sleeper, but this is starting to come through the system. We might have seen disruption to supply, but there's a resource depletion issue. We know that based on current consumption rates, not peak oil, but end of oil is 45 years. End of oil, 45 years. Gas is 150 years, natural gas. And so I think it's going to go longer than 45, 50 years for oil because it'll get so expensive and there'll be a purposeful effort. We won't be consuming at the rate that we are now. Resource depletion is a serious matter. Around the world, apparently, things like sand for cement, quality sand for cement is running out and they're now shipping it around the world for different markets. There'll be supply constraints that we've got serious challenges with the disruption of our conventional agriculture, and so there'll be a lot of supply constraints, finding timber for buildings, etc. These are all major issues, and then we've got to deal with ageing population. And that means that a segment of our community is getting older, they'll require more services, and even though they have the resources to be serviced, there won't be enough younger people to provide those services. And we're hearing this from different countries around the world at the moment. Japan is an example of that. Maybe in terms of population pressure, there are currently 24 countries that actually have declining population in the world. That's 1/10. So that's rather interesting. So all of these things are going to force changes in the way we behave as a consumer. We're going to think a lot more about what we buy, when we buy, and that will be impacted by legislative directions. So the need of the hour. I think that we need better communal dialogue on these issues. We haven't been coming out into town hall meetings to talk about these things, and Robertson Futures, this is one of the things we're doing, is to try and encourage interest from the community so we can have these dialogues. And so all of the things I've been saying today could be challenged, that's fine, but we should be really interested in interrogating ideas until we believe in the validity of them, and then hopefully move forward as a community, because the local council is going to be more responsive if the whole community has had these dialogues. The town hall meetings where different views are put forward and we can talk about them. From my perspective, these are the key drivers that we have to talk about. Is how do we get the availability of local goods and retail services? I think that's with a high population of another 400 dwellings, and they should primarily be filling the gap, the void in more diverse housing that currently exists. And that means a resident threshold of 3,000. Correcting the town's housing imbalance. Footpath construction adds such an important quality to lifestyle. We know there's a revolution taking place around the world in so many places. It hasn't struck us yet, but this is small electric vehicles, bikes and scooters. In some places around the world, it's been absolutely revolution. And it hasn't got here yet, but once it starts, I've heard someone say the other day that there's a bike shop in Kiama, and a few electric bikes were sold, and suddenly the community recognised that electric bikes are really great fun, even if you haven't been riding one before, and now they're everywhere. And my son is here from Kiama, and he's just bought one, and he finds it fantastic. So he's just an example of that. And we need to upgrade our rear lanes so we can improve the quality of our main street and prepare for those additional commercial buildings that I believe will automatically come if we get our population right and we can attract that supermarket that will provide for our weekly needs. Public infrastructure investment. I don't think we've had enough public infrastructure investment in Robertson. if you say that our district generates 5% of the rate income, I tried to do some calcs on that, it might be around about 5%. So the question is, have we been getting 5% of the capital expenditure budget from council? My assessment of that, and this is only a superficial assessment, is no, we have not been getting it. We need to strengthen our local resilience through all of these processes that I've talked about. Because if we don't have to travel externally, we're going to reduce our carbon footprint dramatically. Planning regulations affecting the town have to really accommodate change, and not in 5 years' time or 8 years' time, but as a matter of urgency. If you ask me, have we got a climate crisis? I say no, we've got a climate emergency. We've got a housing emergency. You just have to talk to people who are absolutely in shock by their sudden turn that they can't afford to live in the houses that they're renting, for example. I can recall being in this hall about 12 years ago with all of the councillors and senior staff telling a packed hall of residents that as soon as the sewer comes in, we're going to reduce our minimum lot size from 2,000 down to a smaller size. I was one present at that meeting. Things happened in 12 years. So I hope that the solutions to this aren't going to take another 12 years, because we can't continue what we've been doing. Professor Leslie Stein from Sydney University Planning Department did a study around the world looking at the effectiveness of planning jurisdictions in North America, South America, Europe, Southeast Asia, Australasia. 80 altogether. He ranked New South Wales planning system as 80th. The least effective in the world because of its complexity. Moss Vale DCP, 300 pages. How many people have read it? Not even the councillors who voted for it to set policy would have read that document. I know, I've been a councillor. They don't read this stuff. And so we've got to simplify our regulation. Rigid regulations did not deliver the best outcomes in the traditional townships. The rigid regulations are out of the garden suburbs movement, out of which came the sprawl model. So we just have to really think, have more flexibility and allow creativity in the industry. We need to reduce our carbon footprint through all of these things. And I think really important, any density that comes in, quite often the pushback comes from people who don't like the sort of density that they've seen elsewhere. So if we can give the community some confidence that we're going to get a better quality of building, then I think there'll be less pushback from the community. If we do all of these things, we can achieve reduced travel demand, localised goods and services, improved housing choice, reduced carbon footprint, and leading to a genuine social, environmental and economic sustainability for Robertson. I'm hoping that our future will see us in that sweet green spot in the middle. Thank you all, and Karen, I'll hand over to you and look forward to handling any questions. But I'm particularly interested in hearing opinions to be given as well. I mean, you shouldn't be an expert out the front. The collective wisdom is always greater. Thank you.